Hello.
Kia ora!
This week we're going to tackle Justin Kurzel's latest film, Nitram. And if you can't tell from our black demeanour, it's a bit of a more somber film. Like his previous film, Snowtown, or earlier film, Snowtown, which we're also going to look at.
Yeah, that is a bleak ride, I tell you what.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, it's interesting actually because with Nitram, which is Martin Backwards, which was the name of the massacreist who shot a whole bunch of innocent people in Tasmania in 1996. We also had a similar incident, fueled by quite different motives, but we had a terrible terrorist shooting in Christchurch, not far from us at all. In fact, my children were in the area when it happened. And both of those cases introduced massive sweeping gun reform changes to get rid of sort of semi-automatic weapons and making it a lot harder for people to access weapons, because one of the really disturbing things about Nitram is how easily he can access all these shotguns and assault rifles and things like that.
And at the end of the film, it apparently says that acquiring guns is worse than ever in Australia. But apparently, I read something that said that's not quite true. They misrepresented it, and it's actually 45% better than it was in the 90s when it actually happened.
Well, they certainly haven't had any other massacres of that scale at all since that. So it has been successful, and it's early days for New Zealand, but we also think it was a similarly shocking event that really sort of woke everyone up, and we hope that we will continue to no longer have such shootings. So these are two strangely parallel events. And the thing is, Tasmania and Christchurch, the South Island, we have a weird connection with each other because we're both sort of the smaller, lesser considered islands. We've got similar geography, similar sort of seasonal weather, similar kind of almost mindset. So it's quite strange that over 1996 and a couple of decades later in Christchurch, these two events happened with a very similar outcome. But that aside, we should launch into the actual review of the film, I suppose.
It's written by Sean Grant, who also wrote Snowtown Murders, the first thing that they collaborated on, and he sees it as a sort of a trilogy which they've completed with Nitram, a trilogy of Australian masculinity and crime and violence, with the middle film is True History of the Kelly Gang. Which is more of a sort of a western, but a sort of a punky western. His films are very stylized. He also did a version of Macbeth with Michael Fassbender, which was very, very beautiful. Quite different to the tragedy of Macbeth, which recently came out, of course, but lots of sort of red filters and things like that. So it's very atmospheric, and
Well, funnily enough, I hadn't actually seen any of the director's films before Nitram, which is odd because I really am fascinated with true crime. I mean, the Kelly Gang is one of the most famous sort of like outlaw gangs that you can ever hear of. And there was the Sundance Billy kid in the Sundance Billy.
I don't know much about that.
There's some American sort of Wild West.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Those guys, yeah. So they sort of have these great histories. So, but I don't know why, but I hadn't actually seen any of his films. So Nitram, I've still only ever seen the Snowtown Murders, which we watched yesterday, which was, I really needed to watch some drag queens being silly after that because
it's a harrowing experience.
It's a very harrowing experience. So it's good to see that was his first film. And I could not believe that it was his first film. It's absolutely incredible. So I believe that was good because I've sort of seen the start and the current sort of creations that he's working on. And you can see clearly some of the ideas that he was starting to work with occurring in Snowtown Massacre, which are completed and accelerated and refined in Nitram. It's a fascinating, I wouldn't recommend it as a double feature because it's too depressing, but Nitram is exceptional. It's far more restrained and subjective and objective. It doesn't, what really, really, really blew me away was how different it is from the sensationalist American style true crime films.
Well, he had just made, he made Assassin's Creed, which is a very big budget sort of film based on that video game. So I think he saw this as a return. Well, returning to the true history of the Kelly Gang with some more of Australian themes and crime that he started off with Snowtown, and then he wanted to continue that as well. And his wife, Essie Davis, who was very good in The Babadook, she's a character and plays a character in NetRam as well. So it was, he wanted to come back and make something in Australia with his kids as well. Yeah.
Wow. Very, very perfect film in many ways. I mean, the cinematographer he worked with on Snowtown Murders.
Adam Arkapour, he's great cinematographer.
I'm excited because he did the first season of True Detective, so I kind of went a bit nuts when I found out that that was his first film, Snowtown Murders. Yeah. So it was their first work together.
Well,
and both, like...
yeah, he'd done actually Animal Kingdom prior to that, which was another Australian crime film.
Oh really? What, the cinematographer?
Yeah, Adam Arkapour had done that. So he still started out with David Michôd. He'd done lots of shorts like most cinematographers do. And then I guess Justin Kurzel saw Animal Kingdom and got him to lens Snowtown, which, you know, he has a very distinctive style, and it's a pity he hasn't actually done that many other films after, you know, he's basically just working with Justin Kurzel and David Michôd. Which I guess it's loyal, maybe. But.
It's loyal, but we really hope that more directors give him the opportunity in the future, because he's an exceptional cinematographer. Yeah. His mastery of camera techniques is just stunning. In the very first scenes of, say, in Snowtown Murders, there's this sort of parallel image with a door, and there's these reflections going on, these beautiful sort of landscapes and use of colour and light, which he's, you know, brought even more into NetRam, but he's definitely pulled back as well. Like, it's very simple. It's not as gorgeous. It's a difficult word to say for Snowtown Murders, but it has a certain restraint, but it's still absolutely stunning. And the main actor, who is, you know, he was in Twin Peaks: The Return.
Caleb Landry Jones.
Yes, what was that? And he was in David Cronenberg's son's movie.
Antiviral.
Yep. Definitely. Like, I was thinking, okay, I think he's an amazing actor. He's got tons of potential, but how's he going to do an Aussie accent? They're notoriously difficult.
Well, he learnt that because he had to, with COVID, of course, when he came to Australia, he had to, he watched lots of Australian movies when he was in Texas or wherever he lives, but when he came to Australia, he had to do quarantine in the hotel for a few weeks, and he just got, the producers gave him videos of Neighbours and Home and Away, and he just watched those on repeat, and kind of that's how he learnt the accent.
He nails it. I was shocked. Best actor ever imitating and nailing an Australian accent that I've ever seen.
It's an interesting choice, though. I wonder why they got an American actor to play this very Australian character, you know, when they made the film in Australia, and they could have just gotten one of their very great Australian actors to do it.
Well, I imagine they just, you know, interviewed, sort of casted so many people, and he was the one that...
Because you've said this as well, he doesn't look as attractive as the guy that actually did the murders, the shootings.
He was a very...
Which is kind of the opposite to how it usually works with Hollywood films. They usually get someone who's too attractive, you know? But
he was definitely the best actor for the role. He just... What an incredible performance.
He won Best Performance at Cannes as well, which is quite a big deal.
The film actually got a 7-minute standing ovation at Cannes.
Lots of films get standing ovations at Cannes. They do. I mean, some films get like 20-minute standing ovations.
Really?
Yeah, it's the thing. You either get booed or standing ovations.
Obviously, never been to Cannes. But it has been celebrated. It has been acknowledged. Of course, there's some controversy because, well, say in New Zealand, we have no interest in a film being made about the shootings. Absolutely none. We don't speak the guy's name. We don't distribute any material about him. If he's in the news, his face is blanked out. We're just like, no, he does not exist. Someone did try to make a movie about it, and the whole country basically said, you can just fuck off, because we're not going to let that happen, because we didn't trust that kind of subject matter to be handled by Hollywood. It's just sensationalist. They can't help it. But in this case, considering the director is Australian, considering he would have been around when these things happened, and considering what he did with the subject matter.
But they didn't want this to happen either.
No,
I've just been reading about it, and there was a strong opposition to the film being made, and they didn't get support from, you know, the local government. And when it did come out, it was only in 3 cinemas, and they didn't even advertise it, which is kind of weird. So yeah, it's we understand it, I guess, being from.
We understand it, but I think that the subject matter was handled really, really well.
Yeah.
For example, don't expect to go into this movie to see any actual murders, which was such a... It was so... It didn't... You don't need to show these things. It's like
It's
unnecessary...
more about mental illness, really.
It's more about... Yeah, and isolation and mishandled mental health in the community, and the lack of funding and the lack of understanding. I honestly think it was handled extremely well, extremely compassionately, and yeah, like unnecessary sex scenes, unnecessary scenes of violence. What do they actually bring to the film except for like sensationalism, which Verhoeven really likes to point out. And I think this film really achieved that. In fact, I was really surprised that they got funding for the Snowtown murders, because that's far more graphic and far more disturbing, and doesn't sort of show the... Oh no, it does have some sympathy for some of the victims to some degree, but yeah, really you see it from the perspective of these killers.
He's always been a controversial director in that regard, making films. But I mean, there's, you know, a lot of Australians would have wanted to see a film about John Bunting and those serial murders that he'd done.
So another thing I want to mention is that, like, I don't understand people that go and visit the sites where these murders happen. I don't get people who want to buy art or things off of serial killers. Like, I want to make it clear that I'm really fascinated in true crime and the mentality of serial killers. I like to study it. I just try to like to understand human psychology. I actually studied psych for 1 year. I wish I could have done more, but I had my children. So I'm really interested in criminal and abnormal psychology in particular, but the fact that people will go and visit the sites of these murders just for that reason really makes me sick. I'm not one of those people. I'm not like a murder junkie in that respect, but I do have a fascination and for these kinds of mindsets, and I just really want to understand how they happen and how people can do these things. Is something that I'm quite fixated on, because it's obviously not something that I really understand, and maybe it's misguided, but I feel like if I can understand it, maybe it will make more sense and I won't be so frightened of how people are like this. But for me, the more research I do, the more information I get, the kind of safer I feel, but not so much, and it's not really coming to any, you know, sort of comforting conclusions, but I do think it is interesting, and to investigate different kinds of crimes. And of course the serial killer from Snowtown Murders was actually part of a community, whereas Natram Martin, he was working on his own very much, and there's a myriad of factors at play. He was a troubled lad. There was something different about him. He just couldn't really fit in with his peers. His parents really struggled with him. His dad was very, very forgiving, very caring, quite a sensitive soul. His mother, I think, it broke her to have a son that, if you watch the trailer, she talks about how when he was very young, he laughed at her pain. So she knew from a very early age that something wasn't right, that he didn't connect with people in the same ways. And I think that really broke her down. The performance by the actress she was in,
Judy Davis.
Judy Davis, boy, what both the parents.
Yeah, Anthony LaPaglia is the dad.
Such good performances. All of the cast were just absolutely exceptional. But this is the thing, a lot of films will try to explain or get you to sympathise or villainise someone who's done these things, and I mean, of course, the media completely villainized Martin. In fact, they apparently altered the look in his eyes for the newspapers to make him look more deranged and crazy. But apparently, really, I mean, that's really weird that they did.
They do that sort of thing.
They want to hype up that he's a monster. He's a monster. The thing is, he was just kind of empty. He lacked something. He
had the mental capacity of an 11-year-old, which was important.
Some people believe that, but then again, he took hostages after he'd shot. He took one hostage after he shot a lot of people. So, and there was some planning that went into this murder. It wasn't these murders. It wasn't just off the cuff.
Yeah, that's what people have said anyway.
So there's so much contradictory evidence. Well, all these different psychologists and psychiatrists have said different things about him. It's actually very hard. Originally, his first assessment, they said he had schizophrenia when he was young, and so They said that life would be very hard for his parents because he wasn't really a very easy person to be around. Other psychiatrists have diagnosed him with autism, which would tick a few boxes, but autistic people never really are inclined towards violence. There was a dark, violent urge inside of him. Most people with autism would never dream of hurting animals, but he did. So it's possible that he was a mixture of a psychopath and someone with average intelligence. It's very hard to say. And with this film, you're not going to get any firm conclusions. If you want to read into the case as I did, you'll still be left with some questions. But there was a couple of differences in real life to the film. So what happens to his father, I won't spoil it, did happen in real life, and it was probably a trigger for Martin's behaviour. He did befriend an eccentric woman who was much older than him. It was a lottery winner.
He had more relationships, didn't he?
Well, yeah, actually, apparently he was in a relationship when he committed the murders with a much younger woman. Or maybe that was slightly before. He had a couple of partners. One of them said that she couldn't really date him because he was just too weird. The 16-year-old, when he was 27, she was 16. She said he was actually very nice, but he was quite weird. I'm not quite sure about the other one. But he had some relationships. And his relationship with the wealthy, eccentric lotto winner was not sexual. It was more like two outcasts, two unusual people recognizing each other and connecting with each other and supporting each other. So
he also had an interest in violent pornography, which he showed to young children.
That was something that I read about today, that apparently he would befriend younger children and he'd either tease them or he'd want them to look at really violent, disturbing pornography with him, that's something that wasn't addressed in the film. I think that there was a slightly more sympathetic view that they were trying to take, but you do see him in the film introducing young people to fireworks and kind of causing mayhem with the younger kids, so I suppose that was kind of... But there's no evidence he was a sexual predator, but he certainly had no idea of appropriate boundaries. He had no idea about what was... He couldn't talk to people. People didn't like him. They would recoil from him. In fact, when his wealthy benefactor passes on, which may or may not have been an intentional situation, he travelled overseas 14 times in a couple of years. But apparently he didn't enjoy being in these different places.
Like the plane trips.
He liked the plane trips because people were forced to sit next to him. They couldn't go anywhere for however many hours and were forced to kind of be polite to him and interact with him. And he loved those conversations. So yes, this is someone who was seeking connection.
Yeah.
But that's not a good reason for doing anything violent just because you feel isolated. A lot of people want connection. A lot of people that even have a lot of connection with others still feel alone. But there's a very strong duality in this person, this desire to push people away and also the desire to have people close. It doesn't sound like he wasn't a happy person, and this film just kind of invites you to sort of like walk alongside him in his day-to-day life. And you know, Gilbert and Sullivan music that Helen, the lotto winner, she was really...
He sounds like, of course, he's an even more unhappy person these days. He's just gained a lot of weight, very obese in prison, and he has gained weight by giving the cafeteria workers sexual favours and in return for sweets.
Yeah, so he just wakes up, eats 2-minute noodles and chocolate, goes back to sleep. He's certainly paying for his crimes. He has made a couple of suicide attempts in 2007, wasn't successful, so I think he's on a pretty strong watch. He had expressed suicidal thoughts before, but then also he kind of wanted the whole world to remember him and recognise him, and yeah, very contradictory factors at play. And yeah, Helen, she was unusual but a very sweet person, and that they had a very wholesome connection, I believe, except for he had a tendency to sort of drag the wheel, sort of yank the wheel when she was driving, and she actually complained to her friends about it. So he did really, really inappropriate things. I mean, like, I have a friend I remember in university would sort of play the old bumping back and forth in the lecture hall, and like, but sometimes he'd like bang you really hard, like way too far, and you'd be like, well, that's not cool. It's like some people don't really realise that they're crossing like a little bit of a line. And I think he did that in more extreme ways. He just was a little bit awkward with people. And of course my friends, like, you know, developed since then, but we were all pretty young. But he never was able to make those steps to mature. But yeah, unsettling film, but nowhere near as sensationalist as it could be. Beautifully shot, incredibly acted. The editing's fantastic. The writing's fantastic.
Yeah.
I would say a perfect film about very dark subject matter.
I agree.
But I think there is respect.
Yeah, definitely.
To the people who sadly died as part of this terrible event.
I mean, we don't see anything. Well, we see the build up to it. I mean, that's what the film's all about, really.
Yeah. I do think, I do wish that films like this would not, it's great that these events have made policymakers actually change gun laws, but why aren't we investing more in mental health? I think a lot of this film points to whose responsibility is it to do something about these people that everyone knows could kill someone, that have all of the red flags. Who should care for them, what should we do? And in New Zealand, mental health funding is shocking, it's terrible, and that's only going to get worse as the country falls more and more into poverty. So sadly, I do think a lot of the answers that come out of these situations that are invest in mental health, just maybe lift more people out of poverty, tax the rich, just get them to pay a little bit more tax so that we can invest in social infrastructure and taking care of people. But we're not there yet. It's very frustrating. We will continue to have these sorts of events if we don't, as an entire world and as a society, redistribute the wealth that's going to just some very, very wealthy people and just take care of everyone, because there are huge gaps in the system. There's huge poverty and inequality. Capitalism is the worst damn thing, and this is why these sort of things happen. I think if people are unhappy and isolated, and government, fund organisations like mental health and housing and stuff is underfunded, these things are just going to keep happening. Unfortunately, we haven't fixed the root cause of these problems.
No.
It's definitely not just a person, it's the whole community, it's a whole way of life, it's the way that we live in a hyper-capitalist world. So I am going to give it 5 out of 5 kind of broken hearts, because it's so sad but so important and so well done. I think this is how you do a film about such subject matter. Yeah,
I'd give it a 4, just because it's so depressing, but it's great. It's a near perfect film.
It really is. Yeah. And so that would be 9 out of 10 hearts.
Yeah, which is pretty good.
So yeah, for Nitram, incredible film. I would recommend you see it, but I would say with Snowtown Murders, that is not something I'm going to recommend willy-nilly. In fact, yeah.
Films don't really get to me that much anymore, but I've always found it very hard to get a certain image that sort of happens just over the halfway mark in that film out of my head, and it's very depressing. But it is an amazing film as well, especially if you're into serial killers and things like that.
And also, this is really strange. I can't say I'd actually heard of him. I guess he doesn't fit the usual serial killer profile. This is almost like a community mafia. Is it Brian? Was it his name?
John Bunting.
John Bunting. John Bunting was a man that basically, in the film, you see him meeting a mother and her sons that have all been the sons have been preyed on by a pedophile against her knowledge, and then she finds out about it, and it's devastating for her and the family. They're an incredibly lower economic sort of family in a very low income area, and these children are vulnerable. They've been this.
And then the stranger comes into their lives who seems like he's going to make everything better.
He's going to get justice. He's going to teach them how to fight back, and this is another thing you will not be able to handle if you can't handle animal cruelty. In Australia, kangaroos are pests, and there's a scene where he's chopping up
Samaroos, kangaroo hunting,
and sort of mashing them up and throwing them at this pedophile's place and getting the oldest son to sort of join in. It's sort of like let's get him, and then eventually this pedophile actually leaves the area. So they're kind of getting this, this very charismatic guy. He just looks like a normal guy. He comes into their home, he's cooking them food. these are really impoverished people. Like, someone cooking their sausages and bacon is kind of like a lifeline, and he's fixing their cars and he's fixing stuff. Like, when you have no money,
he's digging holes in the backyard, getting everyone else to dig them.
Yeah, because he's got to do improvements on the house. So when you have nothing and you're extremely vulnerable, especially like this family is, this is kind of like your dream come true. You know, there's a good role model for the sons, and a good partner for the wife, and gee, those sorts of people are so vulnerable. And this chap comes in and he basically exploits that vulnerability. He is a master manipulator. But what's really, really, really strange and disturbing about this case is that people knew what he was doing. They knew that he was killing people. He would sort of have these sort of almost like, it's a very good example of sort of tribalism, of how people think. So you've got this community of people, and they would sort of, the elders of this community sort of, you know, they'd all meet up and they'd be drinking and talking like, what are we going to do about these pedophiles? The police did nothing about that pedophile, which is, yes, that happens, and it's very frustrating. So there's that idea of like, you know, the community has to take it upon themselves to do something about this issue because nobody else will. So he's sort of gauging the community response, you know, to see if he can sort of get away with it. But there was no firm, you know, evidence that any of these sort of people were actually doing what they were doing. But I think when someone's like, I'm here to take out the bad guys when the cops won't do anything, and like, how come I don't get an Anzac parade? I'm taking out the bad guys. You know, the thing is, we have Anzac Day in New Zealand and Australia where I hate this day, and I refuse to have anything to do, where we celebrate all the people that went and died and fought in pointless wars for other people over resources and land. It's just sick.
I agree.
And he made a good point. He's like, well, then why do we celebrate these murderers and torturers, and they don't celebrate, you know, people like us that are vigilantes in our own community? So,
but he's making a point for his own ego. Really.
That's the problem. But the thing is, you know, you tell a community that, and they're going to go, well, yeah, you're right. So he was killing people, and other people were assisting him, covering up, helping him dispose of bodies. So that in itself was a very unusual. I just don't know if, I mean, there's maybe a couple of serial killers that have kind of.
There are serial killers that have had, like, you know, a duo doing it, things like that.
But no one with like a sort of community.
Yeah, well, there might be. I'm sure if there's one, there's probably another case somewhere in the world.
Really disturbing.
But yeah, it's not a common thing.
No, it's not a common thing. And this guy was so clever. He would get people to, while he was, you know, torturing them, he would get them to record messages saying that they were leaving. And then he would chop up the messages. This is in like the 90s, so he's pretty good with the old technology. He was very skilled in a lot of different ways, which leads me to think, you know, he's quite smart. He's definitely psychopathic, very charismatic. And all of this is shown really well in this film. Like the cinematography, like I could see, you know, where the cinematographer was getting some of the gorgeous stuff that he shot in True Detective, which is also quite similar in terms of disturbing sort of killer and, you know, low income areas, and it's quite exciting to see from that perspective, from a cinematic point. But once again, because this isn't Australian, because the violence is shown in such a matter-of-fact way, the whole situation unfolds in such a matter-of-fact way, I think it hits a lot harder. And yes, there is one scene where the killer is sort of, it reminded me of like, so when I've had cats in the past, sometimes the cat would bring a bird in or a mouse, and I'd be trying to get the bird or the mouse off the cat, and the cat would just be staring at it. Like, it would like play with it and then stare at it, then play with it and stare at it, and it's really scary to see. And you just know that, wow, actually this cat's gorgeous and all, but it's a total predator. It's just like a cold-hearted murderer, and that is what you see in this film. So who was the actor that played the main killer?
I'm not sure of his name.
Yeah.
Actually, the guy that played John Bunting. But he was a big name in Australia. Yeah.
Yeah, he did a really good job of depicting that character, and all the actors was very real. And there were people. One of the things I really liked about it is some of the people didn't really seem like actors at all.
No, I'm sure they weren't. The acting wasn't very good. But, you know, I'm glad that he sort of introduce people like that to the filmmaking process.
I really appreciate those kind of things, like actually going into a community and pulling people out that are interesting they don't look like actors, they just look like real people, and that of course adds to the sense of reality. And everything's just so dingy and dirty, just like in Knitram. There's like this sort of dinginess and this sadness, this scruffiness, this sort of despair that infuses everything. So yeah, I gotta say, like, even though this is an incredible film, I don't think I have the stomach to probably watch it again. I mean, I was really interested in the whole dynamic of the community, of the dynamic of the people. Cinematography was great, performances were next level, but it is a grueling watch. So it's one of the few films I'm going to say, like, yeah, if you're sensitive, you can skip it. But I do think Knitram might be okay for people who can, who want to see some of this chap's work, his best work, and not have something that maybe you won't be able to get out of your mind like Nick, and that's not. Yeah, luckily I was prepared for it.
I still think the film's great, and I'd give it like a 3.5.
Yeah, it's a very, very good film, so I'd give it a 4. So it's 7.5 out of 10.
Yeah.
Incredible debut film. I gotta say though, like, I couldn't, as much as I'm interested in all these sort of topics, I couldn't make a movie or write a book like this, because I just get so depressed and so messed up.
Yeah.
So
well, you have to devote quite a stretch of your life to it, the subject matter. So yeah, I know what you mean. So
it's, yeah, he's an interesting person to be able to kind of handle living that day in and day out. And these are important stories to be told. I hope that we learn things about them, at least even just how to like recognize someone who is dangerous and how to avoid them. Because yeah, it certainly helped me when I learned about things like gaslighting and love bombing and certain red flags about the charisma of sociopaths and psychopaths, about how great, you know, how they have these certain tendencies for certain things. It has helped me kind of go, okay, well, that person might be a narcissist, so I might want to avoid them, or helping other friends kind of identify those sort of behaviours and relationships they may have. So I think to some degree it has been helpful. So I appreciate the work that this man does, but I certainly, no matter how strong a stomach I have, I couldn't live and breathe this myself. So yeah, amazing couple of films.
Yep.
Yeah, so I guess that's it from us this week. Like I did, I went and watched some RuPaul, like there were some funny, nice bits of RuPaul after I saw Snowtown Murders, because that's a really great anecdote. What is it, like the antidote for
palate cleanser.
Palate cleanser, and like that was really charming. So go watch some Adore Delano, go watch some Cartier, Ben Cartier, and yeah, if you're gonna watch these films. See you later, guys.
See ya.
Bye.
Be well.